Henry Lewis, a 42-year-old millionaire, had everything most people could only dream of: wealth, power, and fame. Yet, on a quiet night, as he sat alone in his luxurious mansion, Henry realized that despite having it all, there was an unfillable void. He had no heir. A child wasn't just a continuation of his legacy, but also a source of pride, a testament to everything he had built. However, Henry didn't want a traditional family. He had been married twice, and both marriages had ended in failure. To him, love was an illusion, a messy game, but a child was different, an investment, a tangible and clear goal. Henry didn't want to remarry or engage in a romantic relationship. What he needed was a simple, emotionless arrangement. With his resources, he was confident he could find a woman willing to bear his child in exchange for money. To Henry, this was just another business transaction, and like all his deals, he wanted full control. The following morning, while driving his sports car through the bustling city streets, Henry was deep in thought. He needed to find a woman who would accept his terms. As he stopped at an intersection near the city center, his eyes caught an unusual sight. A young woman sitting on the sidewalk, scribbling on an old piece of paper. She had messy brown hair and striking blue eyes, but her tired face and slouched shoulders painted a picture of someone who had endured too much hardship. Something about her captivated Henry. When the light turned green, he tried to ignore the impulse, but couldn't stop glancing back at her. Her patience and focus as she sketched, as if nothing else in the world mattered, intrigued him. A few blocks later, Henry abruptly stopped his car. An idea flashed in his mind, bold and unconventional. Trusting his instincts, he turned the car around and drove back to where the girl was sitting. She was still there, engrossed in her drawing, leaning against the wall behind her. Henry lowered his window and called out, his tone direct and cold. "Hey, you, come here." The woman looked up, her eyes filled with suspicion. She didn't respond immediately, instead observing the well-dressed man in the sleek sports car. Growing impatient, Henry's voice turned firmer. "I don't have all day. Come here." Hesitating briefly, she finally stood and approached. As she came closer, her thin and weary appearance became more evident. Yet, her eyes held a defiant strength. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Henry studied her intently before answering, his gaze scrutinizing every detail of her face. "Get in the car. I'll take you somewhere to talk." She laughed bitterly. "I'm not the kind of person you think I am. If you're about to suggest something indecent, forget it." Henry frowned, clearly annoyed. "I don't have time for nonsense. Get in the car or stay on the sidewalk. The choice is yours." His commanding tone left no room for argument. Still doubtful, the woman eventually opened the car door and got in. The ride to a quiet cafe was silent. The atmosphere in the car was tense, but Henry seemed unbothered. He drove with unwavering focus, while the woman gazed out the window, watching the city scenes blur past. Once seated at a corner table in the cafe, Henry began the conversation. "What's your name?" she replied, unable to hide her suspicion. "Layla Parker." "But what does that matter?" Henry leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "I need to know who I'm dealing with." "Layla, why were you sitting on the sidewalk, drawing like nothing else mattered?" Layla shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do?" "I have nowhere to go. I've lost everything." "But that's none of your business." Henry wasn't deterred by her defensiveness. Locking eyes with her, he spoke bluntly. "I want to make you an offer that could change your life." Layla narrowed her eyes in suspicion. "And what's that?" "I want you to have my child." Layla blinked, stunned by his words. "You're joking, right?" "I'm entirely serious," Henry replied. "I'll cover all your expenses, provide full support throughout the pregnancy, and afterward, you'll receive a substantial sum of money to ensure you'll never have to worry about finances again." Layla laughed, but her tone was laced with unease. "Is this some kind of joke? Who makes an offer like that to a stranger?" Henry remained calm. "Someone who knows what they want and doesn't waste time. I don't want a romantic relationship. I just need a child. It's that simple." Layla stared at him, her eyes filled with confusion and inner turmoil. His words echoed in her mind, a mix of logic and coldness. Henry's unwavering certainty made it hard for her to dismiss his seriousness. But this was a monumental decision, one that would change her life forever. Layla knew she needed time to think. She stood up, thanked Henry for the offer, and left the cafe with a whirlwind of emotions. Meanwhile, Henry remained seated, confident that Layla would return. He understood the desperation of her circumstances. That night, Layla sat on a park bench, pondering Henry's words. She had nowhere to go, nothing to lose. But did she have the courage to give up all maternal rights to her child in exchange for stability? She knew that by tomorrow, her decision would shape her future forever. The garden at the heart of the mansion was a perfect fusion of nature and luxury. The mansion itself, a colossal structure of marble and glass, radiated a cold and calculated air, just like its owner, Henry Lewis. Stephanie led Layla inside, giving her barely any time to take in the dazzling details. Sparkling crystal chandeliers, sweeping marble staircases, and lavish furnishings that looked like they belonged in a design magazine. The overwhelming opulence made Layla uncomfortable. This wasn't her world, but it was about to become her new reality. "Your room," Stephanie said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Layla silently followed. When she entered the room, she was struck by its grandeur. A massive bed with pristine white linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the garden, and a bathroom larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. Stephanie added, "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," before leaving her alone. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers lightly brushing over the soft fabric of the sheets. Just yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalks, and now she was surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Yet, despite the comfort, she felt a heaviness in the air. She wasn't a guest, she was part of a business arrangement. In the days that followed, Layla tried to adjust to her new life. Meals were served punctually, and she underwent her first medical examinations with a team of private doctors. Henry kept his distance, absorbed in work and rarely seen around the house, except when receiving updates from Stephanie about Layla's progress. On one rare occasion, they crossed paths in the hallway. Layla had just returned from a medical checkup when she saw Henry approaching, his posture impeccable and his expression stern. "Are you well?" Henry asked, his tone more obligatory than concerned. Layla hesitated before replying. "Everything seems to be as expected, I suppose." Henry nodded, offering no further comment. But before walking away, he looked at her one last time. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to stay healthy." Layla wasn't sure how to respond. Was his remark genuine kindness, or just a way to ensure the deal proceeded smoothly? Either way, the brief encounter lingered in her thoughts. Despite being treated like royalty, Layla couldn't ignore the unease growing within her. One quiet night, she stood on the balcony of her room, looking down at the moonlit garden. Everything was serene, detached from reality. She wondered if she was doing the right thing. The thought of carrying a child only to give it up grew increasingly complicated. The contract clearly stated she would have no rights to the baby, but she wasn't sure she could handle the emotions involved. Meanwhile, Henry watched from a distance. He recognized Layla's resilience, but also saw the emotional weight she carried. Though he maintained his cold demeanor, he couldn't stop himself from feeling a growing curiosity about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unconventional offer? And why couldn't he entirely dismiss the feeling that she might be more than just a part of his plan? One evening, Layla was in the living room, browsing a book from the shelf. She wasn't a fan of classic literature, but there was something comforting about the quiet of the house and the scent of old books. Henry entered, catching her off guard. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied, a hint of sarcasm in her smile. Henry frowned but didn't respond immediately. He placed the folder on the table and sat down in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked. "I think so," Layla answered hesitantly, "but it still feels strange, like it's not real." Henry leaned forward slightly. "It must feel strange. This is a contract, Layla, an arrangement. I can assure you everything will go exactly as planned. That's what I do, isn't it? Layla let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Sometimes failure is inevitable. You can plan everything, but you can't control emotions. Her words caught Henry off guard. He leaned back in his chair, offering no reply. Layla noticed his reaction but didn't push further. She simply picked up her book and left, leaving Henry lost in thought. In the days that followed, Layla began to adapt to life at the mansion. Despite the vast and luxurious surroundings, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Every expensive item, every decorative piece seemed to scream that this wasn't her world, but she stuck to her routine. Medical appointments, meals prepared by private chefs. At night, alone in her room, she thought about what she had left behind. It wasn't much, but it was the only life she'd known. She wondered if she could go through with this arrangement without losing herself. Meanwhile, Henry continued to observe from afar. He remained discreet but found himself increasingly intrigued. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but a deep curiosity. What was it about this woman that he couldn't stop thinking about? One afternoon, Henry returned home after a long day of meetings. He found Layla sitting on a bench in the garden, her face turned toward the sky. The sight surprised him. For a moment he hesitated, then approached. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked, his tone direct. Layla, slightly startled, replied, "It's beautiful, certainly better than the streets." Henry sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Have you settled in?" Layla shrugged. "I still feel like I'm living someone else's life." Henry was silent for a moment before responding. "That's part of the arrangement. I want you to have everything you need to ensure things go according to plan." Layla nodded but added with a touch of irony, "It's ironic. Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Henry looked at her, surprised by the question. He was used to people agreeing with him without questioning. "Planning is how I ensure things don't fail," he said firmly. Layla gave a faint smile. "But you can't control everything. Sometimes things happen that you can't predict." Her words lingered in Henry's mind. He stood, ending the conversation. "If you need anything, tell Stephanie." Then he walked back to the house. A few days later, Henry decided to accompany Layla to a medical appointment. He justified it as ensuring everything was going smoothly, but deep down, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. At the clinic, routine tests were conducted, and for the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Layla felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she tried to hide them. Henry stood still, his expression unreadable, but something in his gaze shifted. It seemed the sound had reached a part of him he hadn't realized existed. On the way back, the silence in the car became heavy. Henry seemed deep in thought, while Layla didn't know what to say. When they arrived at the mansion, Henry opened the car door for her. A simple gesture, but one that caught her off guard. "Thank you for today," Layla said as she stepped out. "It was the least I could do," Henry replied, avoiding her gaze. In the days that followed, Layla noticed small changes. Henry appeared more often in the common areas of the house, and their conversations, though brief, became less mechanical. He asked about her medical appointments, how she was feeling, and even suggested activities to help her relax. One evening, during dinner, Henry asked, "Have you thought about what you'll do once this is all over?" Layla was surprised. It was the first time he had shown an interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I'm not sure what my life will look like after all this." Henry nodded, appearing to consider her words. "You'll have enough resources to start over wherever you want. Make sure to do something worthwhile." Layla looked at him, intrigued. Beneath the calculated coldness, she sensed a hint of genuine care. And for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone in the mansion. One morning, Layla found a gift waiting outside her room. It was a new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils, accompanied by a note, "To help you pass the time." Layla was speechless. She hadn't expected Henry to remember her passion for drawing, something she had only mentioned in passing during a brief conversation. That evening, as Layla sat in the garden, Henry passed by. "Do you like the gift?" he asked. "Yes," Layla replied, clutching the sketchbook. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Henry shrugged. It seemed like something useful for you. Layla smiled, feeling that the gift was more than just an object. It was a small but meaningful gesture of care between them. Layla began to realize that, although everything in the mansion was meticulously designed to perfection, that perfection wasn't enough to fill the void in her soul. Each day passed with an indescribable emptiness, as if she was merely existing physically, but completely disconnected from the world around her. Henry, the man who remained steadfast and enigmatic, seemed to have more depth than he let on. That morning, when Henry unexpectedly asked to meet her after breakfast, Layla was surprised. It was unusual, as he always maintained a clear distance. A strange feeling crept in as she entered the living room, where he was waiting with a stack of papers in front of him. "I want to go over a few details of the contract," Henry said, his deep voice carrying an unmistakable seriousness. Layla's heart raced. The thought of new, stricter terms made her anxious. She tried to stay composed, masking her growing tension. "I thought everything was already settled," she replied, keeping her tone even. Henry's sharp gaze made her uneasy. After a brief pause, he continued, "Nothing has changed in the terms. I just want to ensure you understand exactly what will happen after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Layla took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I think I understand. After the birth, I'll leave, and you'll continue with your life." Her voice was calm, but inside she was conflicted. Henry nodded slightly. "That's correct. But I want you to know that if you ever need anything, regardless of the agreement, I'll be willing to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." His words stunned Layla. It wasn't what she expected from a man like Henry, who always maintained a cold and distant demeanor. This unexpected concern made her question his motives. "That's surprising to hear from you," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. Henry shrugged, his expression unchanged. "I just want to avoid complications. This is the best way to do that." Layla chuckled softly, though she was inwardly unsettled. There was something about his seriousness that made her reconsider her cynicism. Perhaps he was genuinely trying to be different, even if he didn't yet know how to express it. Henry felt something unfamiliar stirring within him, emotions he couldn't name. He had entered this arrangement expecting simplicity and absolute control. But now, everything seemed to be slipping beyond his grasp. Layla, the woman who was supposed to be just a part of his plan, was introducing a new dimension that left him both curious and apprehensive. This unexpected change unnerved him, as for the first time in his life, he faced something that logic and control could not contain. The following week marked another scheduled checkup. Layla woke early, her emotions a mix of nervousness and excitement. Time seemed to be moving faster than she had anticipated, and the thought of seeing the baby, even just on a screen, made her heart race. She wondered if Henry would attend this appointment. His presence during the last one had surprised her, and today, she wasn't sure what to expect. When she came down for breakfast, she found Stephanie and Henry reviewing some documents. Henry looked up as she approached. "Ready?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone she couldn't quite decipher. "Ready," she replied, trying to appear more composed than she felt. Henry said nothing more, but his silence had an air of finality, leaving no room for hesitation. On the drive to the clinic, the atmosphere in the car felt heavier than usual. Henry, as always, was pensive and focused, but there was something different in his eyes and the way he gripped the steering wheel. An unspoken anxiety he would never admit. At the clinic, the doctor greeted them with a warm smile. Layla lay down, feeling the coolness of the gel on her belly as the ultrasound probe moved across her skin. Henry stood beside her, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the screen. The room grew quiet except for the hum of the machine. Suddenly, a rhythmic sound filled the air, the strong, steady heartbeat of the baby. But the surprises didn't stop there. Not just one, but two, the doctor announced, pointing to the screen. "You're having twins." Layla's eyes widened in shock, her words catching in her throat. Twins. The thought had never crossed her mind. A wave of emotion surged through her. Surprise, joy, and an overwhelming sense of wonder. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly, her eyes glued to the screen. Beside her, Henry stood still, The sternness on his face gave way to an expression she had never seen before. Genuine awe. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the two tiny lives on the screen. Two, he repeated, as if needing confirmation. That's right, the doctor smiled. Both are healthy and developing very well. The clinic room fell silent, save for the steady sound of two heartbeats echoing in the air. Layla felt the moment was magical. Any efforts to maintain emotional detachment seemed to crumble. She couldn't help but feel deeply connected to the two little beings growing inside her. Layla and Henry began to realize that the contract, which had once seemed like a straightforward agreement, was now becoming a bond they couldn't have predicted. The twins, though not yet born, were already reshaping their lives, bringing with them complex emotions and an unforeseen shift in their perspectives. Following the revelation about the twins, a new atmosphere settled between them. Henry remained the cautious and reserved man he always was, but small gestures began to reveal a different side of him. One afternoon, after a checkup, he insisted on escorting Layla to the car, something he would typically leave to Stephanie or another staff member. "Are you okay?" Henry asked, holding the car door open for her. Layla nodded, unable to hide her surprise at his unexpected concern. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." On the drive back to the mansion, the silence between them was no longer cold. Henry broke it unexpectedly. "Is there anything you need? Anything that could make you more comfortable?" Layla glanced at him, trying to discern the true meaning behind his question. It wasn't a superficial concern, but something more genuine. "Nothing comes to mind right now, but thank you for asking," she replied cautiously. Henry nodded, his gaze returning to the road. Yet, in Layla's heart, the sense that everything was changing grew stronger. The next day, Layla returned to her room to find a set of new pillows and a blanket, accompanied by a brief note. "To help you rest better." She couldn't help but smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried significant meaning. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, Henry entered and sat in the chair opposite her. He appeared more at ease than usual, though his signature seriousness remained. "Did you like what I left in your room?" Henry asked directly. "Yes, you were very thoughtful," Layla replied, her eyes curiously studying him. "Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me," he said, his gaze steady on her. Layla frowned slightly. While she appreciated his kindness, a barrier still remained. "You're changing, Henry, or at least it seems that way, but I still don't know why." Henry looked at her, his eyes deep with contemplation. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe you're right. I am changing, but the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The admission surprised Henry as much as it did Layla. It was rare for him to acknowledge any vulnerability, but this was a side of him no one had seen before. Layla reflected on their conversation, sensing that Henry was not the man she initially thought he was. Perhaps beneath the rigid exterior lay someone more genuine, but she wasn't sure whether that was good or bad. The next morning, Henry joined Layla for breakfast, a rare occurrence. "There's something I want to discuss," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "What is it?" Layla asked, curiosity evident in her voice. Henry hesitated before speaking. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people. It's made me difficult to deal with. But with you, with what we're building together, I realize I may have been wrong." Layla blinked, surprised by his unexpected honesty. Henry rarely opened up about himself. "Our barriers, Henry," she said gently, "but that doesn't mean we have to hide behind them forever." Henry nodded as though considering her words. "Maybe you're right, but change isn't easy for me." Layla smiled faintly. No one said it would be easy. That afternoon, Henry decided to join Layla on a walk around the garden. The flowers were in full bloom under the sunlight, and the fresh air brought a rare sense of calm to their relationship. At first, they talked about mundane things: the weather, the garden, changes in the mansion. But soon, the conversation turned to the one thing drawing them closer: the babies. "Have you thought about names?" Henry asked unexpectedly, breaking the silence. Layla turned to him, surprised. "No, I thought that would be something you'd want to decide." Henry shook his head slightly, a rare softness crossing his usually rigid features. "I think it would be fairer if we decided together." His response left Layla astonished. His willingness to collaborate, even on something small, was a sign that he was trying to open up, to be more present. While she remained cautious, she couldn't deny the effort he was making. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the sky turn shades of warm gold and amber. A gentle breeze carried the sweet fragrance of roses. "I never thought I'd be here doing something like this," Layla said, almost to herself. "Neither did I," Henry replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Layla looked at him, realizing that, for the first time, Henry seemed to lower the walls he always kept up. This moment didn't feel like a business transaction anymore. It felt like the beginning of something bigger, something deeper. The next morning began like any other. Layla felt the weight of her late pregnancy in every step, but she was determined to stick to her routine. Henry, as usual, buried himself in his office, surrounded by towering stacks of documents. Yet their interactions had become more frequent, and a quiet comfort was beginning to form, something new and inexplicable to both of them. But that day, everything changed abruptly. Just before lunchtime, Layla felt a sudden pain. At first, she tried to dismiss it as one of the usual discomforts of pregnancy, but as the pain grew stronger, she couldn't deny something was wrong. Calling for Stephanie, Layla barely managed to say a few words before another wave of pain hit, nearly causing her to lose her balance. Stephanie's eyes filled with worry. "Henry needs to know about this," she said, quickly helping Layla to a chair. "This might be the beginning of labor." Layla nodded, trying to steady her breathing as the pain intensified. Stephanie hurried to fetch Henry, and within minutes, he was in the room. His face, typically stoic and emotionless, now showed a rare and genuine concern. "Layla, what's happening?" he asked, moving swiftly toward her. "The babies, they're coming." For a moment, Henry seemed frozen. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he regained his composure. Pulling out his phone, he ordered the car to be prepared and instructed Stephanie to gather everything needed for the hospital. "We're leaving now," he said, his voice firm but laced with urgency. The drive to the hospital was a whirlwind of emotions. Layla struggled to manage the pain while Henry sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly, a small gesture that carried immense meaning. "We're almost there," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "You're going to be okay. We're going to be okay." At the hospital, everything happened quickly. The medical team was ready, thanks to Henry's meticulous preparations, and Layla was rushed into the delivery room. Henry stayed by her side, holding her hand throughout, despite the medical staff's suggestion that he wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." The next few hours were chaotic yet deeply emotional. Henry witnessed Layla's strength as she brought their twins into the world. Each moment seemed to stretch on forever, yet every second was filled with a level of intensity he had never experienced before. When the first cry rang out, the room seemed to hold its breath. "A boy," the doctor announced with a radiant smile. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Henry felt his heart pound as he looked at the tiny baby being placed on the table. A flood of emotions surged within him. Before he could fully process it, a second cry echoed, a soft yet powerful sound that filled the room. "A girl," the doctor said, her eyes shining. Exhausted but radiant, Layla gazed at the twins. She held them close, feeling their fragile warmth and the unbreakable bond they represented. She knew this moment would be brief, but it was etched into her heart forever. Henry stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the baby boy in Layla's arms. For the first time, his face softened completely. "You were incredible," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you." That night, as Layla rested in her hospital room, Henry stayed in the observation area, his eyes never leaving the two tiny babies sleeping in their cribs. The faint light from the hallway cast a gentle glow, creating a strangely serene atmosphere. Henry stood silently, gripping the back of a chair as if grounding himself against the overwhelming tide of feelings. These two small lives were no longer just part of a plan. They represented something far greater, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. He didn't know how to face it. In the past, his life had always been meticulously planned. Strategy, control, and success were the pillars of his world. But now, looking at the babies, he realized he couldn't control how they would grow, who they would become. This loss of control was both terrifying. He stood there for a long time, his eyes fixed on the babies as they stirred slightly in their sleep, their tiny fingers twitching. He closed his eyes as if trying to etch this moment into his memory, a memory he knew would stay with him forever. The next morning, Layla woke up exhausted but overflowing with happiness. When she saw the twins in the nurse's arms, tears welled up in her eyes again. She held them close, feeling every small breath, every tiny movement. Their half-closed eyes, still drowsy, captured her heart completely. Henry entered the room, looking different from his usual cold and composed self. He approached her and the babies with an unusual gentleness. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his deep voice warm. Layla nodded, smiling faintly. "Thank you for everything." Henry said nothing, sitting down beside her instead, his eyes fixed on the babies. After a while, he asked, "Have you thought of names for them?" She shook her head. "I want us to decide together." Henry was silent, as though deep in thought. "Then we'll choose meaningful names," he said with quiet certainty. Layla smiled. "All right, we'll do that." In the days that followed, the twins' arrival brought a new atmosphere to the mansion. Stephanie busied herself rearranging the nursery, which had been designed for one baby, but now needed to accommodate two. Everything was adjusted perfectly, from the matching cribs to the tiny toys. Layla watched these changes with mixed emotions. She knew the contract required her to give up the children, but her love for them was growing stronger with each passing day. Deep down, she realized that parting from them would be far harder than she had ever imagined. Henry, too, was no longer the entirely cold and distant man he had been. He spent more time with Layla and the babies, sometimes simply sitting in silence, watching them sleep. At other times, he involved himself in small tasks, like helping Layla pick out baby clothes or discussing the hiring of a nanny. His demeanor remained calm and composed, but his eyes betrayed a newfound tenderness. One evening, as Layla sat on the terrace, her gaze fixed on the stars above, Henry appeared, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing a cup in front of her. "You know," Layla began, her eyes still on the sky, "sometimes I wonder if all of this is destiny. That we met, these twins, maybe it's all meant to change us." Henry didn't respond immediately. He stood there silently for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe we needed this to learn how to be different." Layla turned to look at him, sensing the sincerity in his words. For the first time, she saw Henry not as a man trying to control everything, but as someone who was beginning to open up. Side by side, there was no need for more words. A peaceful silence enveloped them, not the distant silence of their early days, but a newfound connection. They both knew that what had begun as a contract had evolved into something far beyond terms and signatures. It was love, hope, and the beginning of a family. The morning sunlight streamed softly through the curtains as Stephanie entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee. She gently placed it on the nearby table, her movements careful not to disturb the man lost in his thoughts. "Mr. Lewis, are you all right?" she asked, her tone filled with genuine concern. Henry looked up, his gaze distant and filled with a rare vulnerability. He stayed silent for a long moment, as if wrestling with the right words to say. "For the first time in a long while, I think I am," he finally replied, his voice quiet and deep. Stephanie smiled gently, refraining from saying more. She left him alone, retreating from the room to let him sit in the quiet with his thoughts, his attention unwaveringly fixed on the twins sleeping peacefully in their cribs. In her own room, Layla woke up, a heavy loneliness settling over her. Although she wanted to feel happy, the weight of the contract loomed like a barrier. The twins, the center of all her emotions, would soon no longer be hers. She was acutely aware of this truth, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door creaked open. Henry stepped inside, carrying both babies in his arms. The sight struck her heart, and in that instant something inside her shifted irrevocably. He approached the bed, carefully handing her the baby boy before sitting beside her with the baby girl cradled in his arms. "I don't know how, but this has changed everything," he confessed, his gaze fixed tenderly on the twins. Layla nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. Despite the challenges ahead, she knew this moment was a miracle she would cherish forever. The weeks following the birth were a mix of joy and sorrow. Layla's love for the twins grew deeper each day, but the knowledge that her time at the mansion was nearing its end cast a shadow over every moment. The day of her departure arrived, and she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase. Her eyes lingered on the cribs where the twins slept peacefully. Her heart ached, but she willed herself not to cry. She reminded herself that this was the agreement, the right thing to do. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. Stephanie entered, her expression kind yet worried. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. "Yes, thank you for everything," Layla replied, her voice tight with emotion. When Stephanie suggested that there might be more between her and Henry, Layla could only smile faintly, holding back her tears. "This isn't about what I want, it's about what we agreed upon." Henry was waiting in the foyer. He stood there, his usually calculated and composed demeanor replaced with a raw vulnerability. For the first time, Henry looked as though he was on the verge of losing the most important thing in his life. "Everything's ready," Layla said, breaking the silence. Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes intense and unrelenting. "Are you really going to leave?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Layla felt her throat tighten, but she stood firm. "That's the agreement, Henry. You fulfilled your part. Now it's time for me to go." Henry stared at her for a long moment before reaching into his pocket. Without hesitation, he pulled out the contract and tore it into pieces, letting the fragments fall to the floor. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the room. "I don't want you to leave, Layla," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't want this to end here." His words left Layla stunned, rooted in place. "Henry, you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple," she said, trying to maintain her resolve. Henry stepped closer, his gaze filled with determination. "I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me. But these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Layla, not just because of the twins, but because you've brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing." Her voice wavered as she asked, "How do I know this is real? How do I know you won't change your mind when things get hard?" Henry looked straight into her eyes, his voice steady and warm. "Because I've tried living without connection, and it left me empty. You've shown me that it's okay not to be afraid of it. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose you, Layla. Not now, not ever." His words broke through her defenses. "What if it doesn't work?" she whispered. "Then we'll try again, and again if we have to." "I'll never give up on you, Layla," Henry said firmly. Finally, Layla nodded, letting her tears fall freely. "Okay, I'll stay." In the weeks that followed, life began to change. Henry threw himself into being a dedicated father and a reliable partner. He learned how to care for the twins, changing diapers, preparing bottles, and soothing them to sleep. Although he was sometimes clumsy, his efforts touched Layla deeply. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Henry turned to Layla. "I want us to be a real family," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side forever." "Henry, that's a big step," she replied. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said, taking her hand. "I want to build something with you, not based on a contract, but on love." Layla smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I want that too." The ceremony was held in the mansion's garden. Under the soft sunlight and amidst vibrant blooms, Henry and Layla exchanged vows, spoken from the heart. They promised to build a loving family together, bound by nothing but love. With the twins cradled in their arms, they knew they had finally found where they belonged. A complete family. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a true family. One quiet night, as Lila was soothing the twins to sleep in the soft glow of the nightlight, Henry appeared in the doorway. Without a word, he walked over to her and wrapped his arms tightly around her from behind. Lila rested her head on his chest, listening to the familiar heartbeat that she had memorized in every moment. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Henry whispered, his voice like a soft breeze. Lila looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "And thank you for showing me that I can trust you again," she replied, her voice trembling but sincere. A few months later, on a sunny afternoon, Henry and Lila enjoyed a warm moment together in the expansive garden of the villa. The twins were playing on a soft rug spread out on the grass, their laughter echoing through the air, bringing a pure joy unlike any other. Lila turned to look at Henry, who was sitting next to her. She caught him smiling, his gaze never leaving the two children. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Henry turned to look at her. Then his eyes returned to the twins chattering on the rug. "I never thought I could be this happy," he replied, his voice full of emotion. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed. A family, a purpose, and love." Lila smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even when it has to overcome difficult challenges." "Thank you for that," she answered, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. They leaned toward each other, sharing a gentle kiss. At that moment, the twins' babbling rang out, something that sounded very much like Mama and Dada. Henry and Lila laughed out loud, overwhelmed with emotion. They moved closer to the children, embracing them, surrounding them with all the love they had. That moment was simple but full of meaning. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a life full of love, understanding, and hope. It was everything Henry and Lila needed to move forward. Life doesn't always go according to plan, but sometimes the surprises bring true meaning. Henry and Lila proved that love can be built, not only from perfection, but also through stumbles, pain, and challenges. More importantly, trust, patience, and the courage to open one's heart are the foundations of a happy family. Thank you for following the story. Please share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next emotional tales. See you soon.